Just heard, this meeting will be recorded, so we can have it later on YouTube. My name is Sammy Castongway with Friends of the Owyhee, and thank you all so much for joining us for our first webinar of the year. Last year, we were able to host Scott from ODF&W, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, to talk about the bighorn sheep population of the Owyhee and sort of a status update. And we were not able to record that meeting, unfortunately. So we graciously invited Scott back this year to talk to us about the bighorn sheep and actually record it this year. So thank you so much, Scott, for joining us. I'll give a little tiny bit of an intro and then I'll let you take it away. Does that sound okay, Scott?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Excellent. So Scott was born and raised as a Oregonian. He received his Bachelor's of Science in Wildlife Science from Oregon State University in 2001. And he's been part of the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Ontario's field office since 2004, where he works as an assistant district wildlife. Among his many responsibilities is being bighorn sheep capture boss, a position he's maintained for the past 4 years. As capture boss, he coordinates capture and collar contracts and capture logistics with fellow ODF&W districts. Though he primarily focuses on sampling bighorn sheep herds through Oregon, he's also coordinated bighorn sheep monitoring with other states as well. So let's see. Scott, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll remind folks that please keep your microphone muted. I'll go through all the attendees and try to mute you manually. But if you could look down at your microphone and mute yourself, thank you. All right, Scott.
All right. I'll try to share my screen and get this going. All right, does that show up yet?
Not yet, I don't think.
All right, we'll keep clicking on the buttons
Okay.
here. Share screen. Share. Okay. We've got it. All right, I'll get started then. So, like Sammy said, I'll be talking about the Lower Owyhee Bighorn sheep herd more specifically, but just to give a general overview of what's going on with our bighorn sheep, just some basic biology, some history of Oregon's bighorns, restoration efforts, which led to what we have today for bighorns, and also more focused on the Lower Owyhee and some management challenges we're facing, some disease issues, and also some volunteer work we're coming up with here this spring. So what are California bighorn sheep? So they're Ovis canadensis californicus. So they're considered a subspecies of Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, and that is primarily based on morphological descriptions. So that information was used to predate our genetic information that we use now. So that with that, they're typically a little bit smaller, less blocky of a build, and smaller horns than their Rocky Mountain counterparts. So, and basically they're a K-selected species, like a lot of ungulates. So they're polygamous, with the rams doing, dominant ram doing most of the breeding. And then the breeding season is October, November. So it's kind of a longer breeding season window than like you'd see in deer and elk. And then ewes are more reproductively active from the that, well, 3 to 12 years old, maybe a little bit more. So, and for ungulates, they have a fairly short gestation period of 180 days, with the lambs in our area being born in April and May, and mostly kind of in the middle there. So, and generally have one lamb. We do have an occasional ewe that'll drop twins, but it's not always the case. So, and their habitats are, as you can imagine, bighorn sheep, you know, they need the cliffs, the rim rocks, and the outcroppings. The canyons and the fault block rims of Eastern Oregon are excellent for them. And one thing that they really need is that escape terrain for lambs. So that's really important for growing the young ones. So, and their diets, they're primarily eat grass. But they're pretty much a generalist as well. I mean, if there's shrubs and forbs, they'll eat them as well, and when they're available. And so some of the history of our California bighorns is bighorns are native to the steeper terrain of Eastern Oregon. And we actually had a first regulated hunting season in 1899. And so and that was with the recognition that our sheep herds were struggling. And so by 1911, these herds had received full protection by the state of Oregon, and then they were considered extirpated, at least the California bighorn sheep, by 1915. And the last known bighorns were in the Steens Mountains. So what happened? Well, unregulated hunting. So, it was the Wild West days, fend for yourself, right? And competition for forage and livestock, or forage from livestock. So the stocking rates back in the turn of the century were just astronomical compared to what we have today. But really the big thing, and obviously highlighted, is disease and parasites. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. So with the extirpation of the sheep, the department began its first really California effort in 1954 to establish California bighorns back into Oregon. And that started with 20 bighorn sheep from Williams Lake, British Columbia, and they were put into a holding pen on Hart Mountain. And then from there, Hart became kind of the source stock for much of the West and Oregon. And over the years, we've transplanted over 600 sheep out of Hart Mountain throughout, like I said, the West and a lot of Oregon as well. And so, and then from Oregon as a whole, we've moved almost 1,200 bighorn sheep. And actually that number is a little higher because we've done a few more since then. So that's really kind of how bighorns have moved across the West, is the stories like Oregon has, which is similar to other Western states. And so currently Oregon has about 30 different herds of California bighorn sheep. We also have some Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. And for reference there, those herds are north and east of I-84. And so to focus more on the Lower Owyhee herd, so we do have a little smaller herd that runs in what we call the Upper Owyhee. So our Lower Owyhee is more or less from Rome downstream, and then our Upper Owyhee is Rome to the Idaho border. So the Lower Owyhee herd was established in 1965 with bighorns from Hart Mountain, and it's the third oldest bighorn herd in the state of Oregon. So, and it's got a pretty big range throughout that Lower Owyhee country. We've seen sheep on Saddle Butte, and then all the way up to the Dry Creek arm of the Owyhee Reservoir. And that's about 350 square miles of habitat. So I've got some work to do to refine that home range, but that's for a project for another day. And the transplant history is pretty interesting, and we'll talk about a little bit more details as we move forward. But like I said, started in 65, and then went for a long time before we did another transplant in 1983, and we bought another 21 sheep from Hart Mountain. And then again in 87, we had another 15 sheep from Hart Mountain, and then actually 2 releases that year, one in Painted Canyon, the other one in Red Butte. And then also in 94, we brought sheep in from the Steens, which is also, original source stock from Hart Mountain as well. And then we started to diversify our releases, and we did some work and released some sheep in 2002 or 1 and 2, and for some genetic management issues. So so what we're doing on a management scale for these things, or have done, is genetic diversity. So like I said, you know, that original source stock from Williams Lake, British Columbia, and those previous ones up through 94 were all a very genetically similar sheep. And so we, as an agency, wanted to diversify the genetics within those herds, because we did see some decline herd performance leading up to that. It just wasn't the sheep numbers we felt that could be supported in the Waihi Canyon. So in 01 and 02, we brought in sheep. Actually, they're from the Santa Rosas in Nevada, and they were a different source stock from Penticton, British Columbia. And so we brought in those new sheep. We also sampled sheep at that time before bringing them in to get a genetic makeup. And then in 07, we came back and resampled 50 sheep to see if that genetic diversity had you know, those genetics had been expressed in the population. And really, from the work that with the PhD student that was looking at that, found that it definitely increased, you know, that genetic diversity. You know, so check the box. You know, we're getting some more genetic diversity in our herds. You know, good management and good results. Then we also had, from that same project of monitoring those sheep that were released, we had some technicians on board monitoring them, and they found multiple incidences in late one summer of sheep dying at springs and along the reservoir, and that was from cyanobacteria poisoning. And so the solution was Guzzlers. And so that started another project where, as you can see in the background, there's an apron that catches water, and then buried down below it is a 1,700 gallon tank, and then off to the side is a drinker, which holds the water. And so that was a pretty big project. So it was definitely a cooperative effort between ODFW, the BLM, the Bureau of Reclamation, and multiple NGOs. And so over that time period, we installed 10 new Guzzlers and replaced 2 existing ones and upgraded them and stuff like that. So that was a good project, and it was successful. So and then you see there's a ram with a yellow ear tag, number 14 there. He was a ram that was collared from that genetic study. So it's just kind of things were plugging right along. So life was good, right? So adjusted or addressed the genetic issues. We improved water quality and availability to the sheep by putting Guzzlers out on the landscape. We had a growing population. We even added a hunting season. We had good quality rams and lots of them. So it was like, that's what we have them for, is that opportunity for hunters. And in March of 15, we had at least 400, if not more, bighorns on the landscape. But then October 15 came around, and this is when the story changes course. It's not as positive as we'd like it to be. So I got a phone call from a hunter that said he found a dead bighorn down in Leslie Gulch. So I made my way down there and found this guy on my way there as well. So Mycoplasma oedemonii, it's a big word, and I'm going to substitute it for MOV. And so this is a species of Mycoplasma bacteria. It's a respiratory pathogen of domestic sheep and wild sheep and goats. And so what happens is, when you get an exposure into a naive bighorn herd, you'll have an all-age die-off, reduced lamb recruitment, and then it remains chronic in the population. So what happened? There's a domestic conflict or contact somewhere. So there is potential for 3 sources of domestic contact, although that herd persisted for 50 years with the same risks on the landscape. It's kind of a ticking time bomb in some efforts. And so we were able to run a PCR strain type on the strain of MOV, and it was novel, so that eliminated exposure from other bighorn herds with the known disease. And we saw a 75% decrease in that population. So it was pretty drastic to see that loss, and that was just within 6 months really of detecting it. So, and then the downfall of MOV in these herds is the lambs are fairly naive to the disease and can't stand exposure, and so our lamb recruitment really just drops off. We should be seeing lamb recruitment in the 20 to 50 lambs per 100 ewes when we survey in March, and it's usually if we see one or two, we're lucky. So it really drops off, and of course with no sheep on the ground, we closed hunting season as well. So what have we done? So we're continuing to do our annual spring helicopter surveys to count them. And then we've also collared 15 individuals to monitor their movements so they don't move into, let's say, Idaho, into the Front Range over there and pass that disease there. And then also wanted to get an understanding of survival rates and then the disease makeup of those ones we sampled after the die-off. And so we've kind of been on hold on moving forward because the options for managing MOV in these herds is very difficult. So we still got to work on addressing domestic conflicts. That's kind of always a moving target that we're working on. And we can't bring in new bighorns as well, because the new ones we'd bring in would be naive to the disease and would die at the same rate. And so we would just, wouldn't buy us much at all. There's a new technique out there that's developed in what we call the tri-state area from a bighorn standpoint. So that's in the corner of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, where they've done a bunch of work of capturing as many individuals as they can and testing them for the mycoplasma disease. And if they are determined to be a chronic shedder of the disease, they'll remove them. So it's a technique that we're also working on in other herds in Oregon, but it's a tough area. At least the Lower Owyhee is a tough area to capture sheep in from a helicopter standpoint, and you got to capture all of them to make it work. And so difficult terrain to do that in. We could start over, but again, that would mean removing all the sheep that are there, and that removing those sheep isn't necessarily something we want to do, because they retain that knowledge of the landscape and the escape terrain and how to manage the predators on the landscape that they're used to dealing with. Or we could wait and see, and that's kind of where we've been doing, and what we've been seeing is a continuing decline of that herd. And so we're kind of at a crossroads of where do we go and what do we do. And that leads us to figuring out how many are left in this herd. And so this year we had a contract with Waihi Air, and they have a capability of doing aerial infrared surveys. And so those results are still pending, but they did see a handful of sheep, but not as many as we were hoping. Our traditional helicopter surveys that we do in February, March struggle to find bighorns. So some years we only see a single group of maybe a dozen, and then aren't able to locate them again the next year. So it's a challenge. And so our next effort is a coordinated ground survey using volunteers and agency staff in this May, on the 20th of May. And so, and that'll help us, hopefully between the 3 survey efforts, we'll be able to establish a minimum population and the distribution across the landscape. And like I said, we'll be surveying as much of the country as we can from Iron Point up to Dry Creek. And if people are interested, we'll need folks with spotting scopes and binoculars and a means of travel into that country, which we're all aware can be pretty tough. And then, people that are willing to hike, and some of the routes are a little easier, but most of them are pretty difficult terrain to cover a lot of ground in. So, and here's just kind of a snapshot of that, how we've broken up that landscape into looking for these sheep, and we can't cover it all. There's just too much to do it all, but I've got, some GPS collar data from the 15 collars we put out. So I have a pretty good idea of where their haunts and hides are, and also, years of surveying these things with a helicopter. And so that'll be a pretty good view of the landscape when it comes to looking at bighorns. And so I'm reaching out to you guys, the Friends of the Owyhee, if you're interested. We have the Oregon Wild Sheep Foundation is going to be coordinating the volunteers for the survey. And so if Friends of the Owyhee would reach out as a group and to Craig Foster, and he can help kind of, right now we're just trying to establish a list of volunteers and what their capabilities are and what they have. And then once we kind of get an idea of how many folks we got lined up, we're going to get that survey going. So that's a pretty quick run through of my slides, but that is the end of it. So.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. I took a second there to use my clap hand reaction, but hopefully all in your mind. Let's give a little hand to Scott. So open the floor for questions. I think the easiest way to do this, as Chuck just did, is to enter your question in the chat. I'll monitor the chat while Scott answers the question. The first question there from Chuck is, what is the latest estimate of the current population? And I think you're probably looking for individuals.
Yeah, and so that's really what we're trying to establish with this this year's or this spring surveys. So last year we saw 40, and that was a big surprise. It's because the previous years we'd only seen maybe a dozen. So I know there's at least 40 out there from last year, but I'm guessing. Oh boy, that's why we're doing all the volunteer work, is to figure that out in the additional flights. So.
And then a question from Jim Hammett. Is the Lower Owyhee isolated from the Upper Owyhee, and are they affected?
Yeah, so we've done a fair amount of collaring work and haven't seen or documented any movement between the Lower Owyhee and the Upper Owyhee herds. So there is quite a expansive canyon where we just haven't seen any bighorn use. So once you leave Chalk Basin there at Iron Point and head upstream to Rome, you know, we've looked through that country numerous times, but it just doesn't have the big enough terrain to really maintain a population. Sheep do move, but and then from Rome upstream towards the Idaho border, it's 5 or 6 miles above Rome before we really start seeing any bighorn use up in that country. So they'll always surprise you and move around. But as far as we can tell from collaring efforts, that they remain separated for the most part,
And Scott, are those that are in the Upper Owyhee sheep also affected by the disease?
Yeah, that's another box of rocks. So I've got a few too many irons in the fire right now with bighorn stuff, and we're going to be tackling that issue in another 3 or 4 years. But we suspect that there's been a MOV exposure probably in that 2007, 2008 time period, but we just haven't had it. Country's difficult to survey, it's difficult to access, it's difficult to find sheep consistently, and we're starting that conversation with Idaho on what they've been doing and what we need to do and start moving forward. But I've got the Lower Owyhee herd to deal with, and also some other stuff going on in 10-mile rattlesnake herds in the south end of the district as well. So it's a pending project.
Yeah, if any other folks have questions, go ahead and drop them there in the chat. But Scott, I had a sort of a question comment. A few weeks ago, I saw a YouTube video about an ION coalition. So that would be Idaho, Oregon, Nevada, that were capturing bighorn. And I'm not sure if this was an older video or more recent, but can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, that video is really hot off the press. So about this time last year, the wild sheep groups of the representative states from Oregon, Idaho, and Nevada came together in collaboration with states and other agencies to kind of form a group with the intent of really working on collaboration and communication amongst these shared herds in the 3 states. So there's a lot of issues that we're all trying to address. Everything from horses in Nevada to managing MOV in herds and stuff like that. So there's just trying to get an understanding of what's going on, and with the formation of that Oregon, Idaho, Nevada, so ION group, they were able to submit a grant. The wild sheep groups were able to come together and do this. Let me be clear, the agencies provided information, but they submitted a grant to the National Wild Sheep Foundation, and we received, I think it was $172,000 grant between the 3 states to do a bunch of work and get started on a bunch of work. So some of this is the test and removal work that we're doing with Nevada and Oregon on the 10-mile High Peak and Santa Rosa herds down there. And some of it paid for that Owyhee air survey. And then also for our coordinated ground survey, we got some money to help pay for volunteer mileage. A lot of folks that come help on these wild sheep projects are traveling a long ways, and so we got some money to help support there. So really that ION group kicked off pretty strong in getting some money and getting some projects paid for and moving for Bighorn sheep, not just in Oregon but in the other states that border as well.
That's really great. Thanks for telling us a little bit about that. I was trying to video real quickly. I can't, but I'll try to find it during the next questions and drop it here in the chat. We also have a question from Trista. Are any bighorns thought to be on the west side of the Owyhee State Reservoir near the airstrip, the east side?
Yeah, so there's a group, and I just call them the Dry Creek herd, sub-herd really. And so they'll move all the way from the Dry Creek arm of the Owyhee, which is there on the west side, all the way down up Acton Gulch, which is down by the just before the airstrip there. And so and then once you get below that, there's kind of a gap in quality habitat. They'll move through that country, and then you'll get down towards the Rooster Comb and that stuff. And those sheep on the Rooster Comb, I'm not sure how they move across or where they move across from, but they'll move up to Red Butte and in that country as well. So yeah, there's little subherds that move around that country.
We also have a question from Elaine. Comment: we have seen bighorn sheep with babies in the Reynolds Creek area of the Owyhees. Hopefully that means they aren't affected there on the Idaho side. Question mark?
Yeah, I can't speak directly to what's going on in Reynolds Creek, but yeah, I think they're doing pretty good over there as far as I understand. So yeah, but that said, that's the Idaho side, so I don't know the details.
Yeah, I did just ask a wildlife biologist that doesn't coordinate bighorn there, and she did say that they're doing great on the front of the Idaho side, but it's the deeper country the population is struggling with. And that was just a kind of an offhand email comment by someone at the Idaho Wildlife.
That's my understanding as well. It's stuff up towards Jack Creek and further up in the Waihi system, they might have some issues that they're trying to address. So
yeah. From Jamra, has MOV been found in local domestic sheep in Eastern Oregon? And then how has it been treated?
Yeah, and so treating so MOV in domestic sheep, it's common in almost all flocks of domestic sheep, and for domestics, occasionally it'll have some reduced, fecundity of those sheep, but usually it doesn't really bother them. It's just like you and I having a common cold, and that's about it in from a domestic sheep standpoint. So most domestic sheep do have it, and treating it has been a huge challenge. There's been some work done in Canada, so they have their wildlife veterinarian Helen up there. She has working on a nasal flush, which takes and it works. It's been done in small herds, and so you're talking 50 to 60 sheep, but they need a nasal flush for 5 days in a row, and so it's so it's still kind of emerging science, and it's a lot of work to get them cleared, and they'll still have some positive ones that they'll just remove from those small farm flocks as well. So it's a challenge to deal with. Also, the state of Washington, their Game and Fish Department has been trying to establish a MOV free herd of domestic sheep, because the part of the challenges they have in that tri-state area that I mentioned earlier up on Oregon, Washington, Idaho borders, there's a fair number of smaller landowners that like to maintain those farm flock herds for wool sheep and meat sheep and stuff like that, and they've struggled to get those herds clear of MOV. So a lot of work still pending and trying to be done to clear the domestics. So it's still a struggle, but separation is really the best means of keeping MOV free bighorns.
And from Jim Hammett, there's a couple of questions in here, but I'll read the whole thing. Is there evidence of natural immunity gained from natural selection, such that perhaps eventually the disease will become manageable? And then, and does it seem that the Sheep's Head Mountains of the Upper Owyhee and Santa Rosa herds, they're awfully close together and at risk? Would it be best to eliminate, if possible, the Lower Owyhee herd and start?
Yeah, that's a lot of questions there, Jim, and we've addressed a lot of those in some manner over the years. So the Santa Rosa, they're MOV positive, and that started in 2003 and spread up into Oregon, into 10 Mile and Rattlesnake. And so we're actively working a test and removal program in conjunction with Nevada right now to hopefully eliminate MOV from those herds. And so that's a work in progress. But it's been about 2016, I believe it was, as knowing that MOV was on the landscape out there, we sampled the sheep heads, and then the Steens, the Pueblos, Riverside herd, and then also up in the John Day country. But we sampled all those herds with concerns in monitoring those populations for MOV, and they were all negative with no exposure. So that's good news. We haven't had any movement that we've been able to document into those herds. Also, the Trout Creek Mountains herd is clear of MOV as well. We did have a grad student that worked from 2015, 16, and 17 down in that country in the Santa Rosas, the Trout Creeks, and then the 10 Mile Rattlesnake herds, and monitored those herds for MOV. So there's a whole gamut of research that came out of that project related to MOV in our lambs and survival and stuff. So we haven't had any movement that we've documented between those herds. Some herds have been removed. So as part of that project, the PhD project down in that country, Nevada was sampling their Montana Mountain herd, and the year escapes me now, but it was probably 18, I'm guessing. They went in and to collar sheep for the project, and they noticed some of them were sick, and as soon as they got collars out, they had multiple mortalities. And so with the high rate of mortality and the risk of MOV spreading into the Trout Creek Mountains herd to the north and the Double H Mountains to the south in Nevada, they chose to eliminate that herd. And it was a smaller herd of somewhere around max population of about 80 individuals. So that's been done. Nevada had to remove a herd to prevent that spillover into other herds, adjacent herds. And so, and then your last question there is starting over. That's a consideration. That's kind of why we're trying to figure out how many we have here. We've got bighorns in Oregon to move around. So our Deschutes and John Day populations are very robust right now, and we're looking to reduce, shrink those populations down a little bit. They're getting a little too many sheep for the habitat to support. And so, like I said, that's why we're wanting to figure out how many we got. So if we've got only a few left, we'll remove them, or as an option to remove them and start over again. But when you remove those sheep, you also lose that knowledge of the landscape, and new releases take a lot more sheep. Especially with cougar predation on the landscape, those cats find those naive sheep to the landscape, and the cats win pretty quick. So
Yeah, great there. That was a really thorough question, Jim, and very insightful answer, of course. Chuck had another question. Do you know if the herds along the Deschutes and John Day have also been affected by MOV?
So not to our knowledge at this time. So those herds are still growing. Lamb ratios are strong, and that's really your indicator of a healthy herd is good strong lamb recruitment. So those districts up there monitor those herds quite closely as far as lamb recruitment goes, with multiple surveys throughout the summer and fall and spring as well. So it's kind of, it's always crossing our fingers, hoping they remain healthy as long as they can.
Trista asks, what management tools are you using to reduce contact with domestic sheep?
And so that's really a separation thing, so if you can keep, I think our sheep plan calls for 25 miles of separation between domestics and bighorn herds, and that can be a challenge. So as a state agency, we don't have a lot of flexibility on the or influence on the federal management side. So we are working with the BLM to address our concerns, but it's a tough road to get permits changed or transition to cattle from sheep and stuff like that. So there is, in these herds right now, there is quite a bit of separation. But like I said, they persisted in the landscape for 50 years before having an exposure. So we have been pretty lucky. And so a lot of it's just working with our Wild Sheep Foundation groups to address those private land issues and NGOs and whatnot, to work with BLM and get support and get things moved. But like I said, it's a tough challenge. And producers are concerned and worried about the influence of their domestic flocks on wild sheep as well. So it's a sensitive issue for sure.
Well, thanks a lot for answering all the questions. I'll put one more call for questions, and but I wanted to come back to slide, Scott, which is really neat that you're through the lead contact there reaching out to us, a nonprofit organization that cares very, very much for the entire landscape of the Waihi front, to reach out for potentially some help. So hopefully we can gather up some volunteers that know those roads out there real well from driving them with UHVs or four-wheel drive, and folks with good hike and spotting scopes. I think we can probably round some folks up. And thanks for putting the date out there so we can all begin thinking about that. And I would say, folks, if you are interested in then being under the Friends of the Owyhee's coordinated team, you can just get a hold of me after I send out the post webinar material. Hopefully, I find that YouTube video, but also the recording from this conversation. You can reply back to me that you'd like to be. So then I'll get in contact with the lead coordinator with our list of volunteers. Okay. It doesn't look like there's any more questions. Lynn Kelly does say very informative program. Thank you. And thank you for, Becky Reed says, thank you for sharing your evening. Appreciated the learnings. And thank you for your hard work. And absolutely. Thanks for coming back again this year to give us another update on the herd, and hopefully looking forward to learning about the herd in the future in the next few months. All right.
Yeah,
thank you very much, Scott. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, and it's good to speak to you guys again, and look forward to hopefully seeing some folks out in the field in May.
Excellent. All right. Y'all have a good night, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.